Hi, my name is Random Guy Reviews. I do reviews of books, movies, TV shows, and any other types of media that I consume in these poorly edited, low effort videos that I have on my channel. And in this specific video, I am reviewing the comic book Doomsday Clock by writer Geoff Johns and artist Gary Frank. This is the supposed sequel, or at least the comic book sequel, of the classic graphic novel Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And yeah, so the reason why I'm doing a review of this instead of the original is because of the fact that my opinion on the original is the exact same as most people's opinion on it. There is nothing interesting there. All I have to say about it is that, yeah, it's really good. It's a classic, and it's probably one of the most important graphic novels in the history of graphic novels. So yeah, that's why I'm reviewing this instead. So where do I even start with this? Okay, a bit of context, I suppose. This story was first teased back when I was in my first year of high school. It was in DC Rebirth #1, which was like the first DC comic I read in a long time at that time. And then it was officially announced right after I finished my college entry test, about 2 or 3 years later. And finally, the story was completed around the time I began writing my undergraduate thesis, which was last year. So to say that this story took a long time to finish might be a bit of an understatement. And as expected from stories like that, it is a very complicated story. And I'm going to approach this review by stating the stuff that I dislike first, and then the stuff that I do like, and before I get to my conclusion. So, knowing that this was written by the biggest DC lore nerd, Geoff Johns, should have made me realize that this wouldn't be a straight up sequel. A lot of the problems that I have revolve around the fact that there is a fundamental difference between the world of Watchmen and the world of the DC universe. And while at times the contrasts do make for a good or compelling story, I feel like most of the time it flat out just doesn't work. The tone of this book was very wonky. It goes from the gritty realism of Watchmen's world and then immediately switching into this idealized version of the DC universe, something that is completely the opposite of Watchmen's world. Not only that, this book even attempts at making this idealized DC universe to be something dark and gritty, but a lot of the time it just becomes edgy instead of realistic, which means that it's not something that is very compelling to me. The tone problem becomes even more of a problem when you compare it to the original. The original is a deconstruction, and by that I mean in the TV trope sense of the word, of superhero tropes that were common back then when it came out. There are moments that feel like the book is trying to deconstruct something related to DC's canon, but mostly it just either fall really flat or really complicated to the point where I had to keep rereading bits in order to understand what the book is trying to do. This is exacerbated by the second major problem, and that is the lack of focus. While the other, better, sequel, HBO's Watchmen, takes a contemporary issue, which is race issues, that is not only well fleshed out, but is not a retread compared to the original. Doomsday Clock began by retreading the same grounds as the original, which is nuclear war or Cold War, but instead replacing the nukes with superheroes. Then, as it continues on, it began putting out so many different ideas and themes. Many of them never really fleshed out, and it felt like the themes were just there because they're cool, I suppose. I don't know. HBO's Watchmen worked really well for me, partly because it followed the spirit of the original. Cold War was a big thing in the 80s, and race issues have never been more relevant than it is today. In doing the retreading and the subsequent lack of thematic clarity, I think Doomsday Clock didn't completely work as a Watchmen sequel. If anything, I think it failed as a Watchmen sequel. And not to mention, the closer I was to the end of the book, the more I realized that this was less of a Watchmen sequel and more of a convoluted attempt to rationalize the inherently inconsistent and unstable DC universe. And I say that it's inherently inconsistent and unstable because that is just the nature of comic books. That is just the nature of the medium. That said, even though I've said a lot of bad things about this book, there are even more stuff that I like. For starters, the art is amazing. It's probably part of why it took so long to finish, and if it was, then I think it's totally worth it. The use of 3x3 panel structure, while not quite at the level of Moore and Gibbons, still elevated the storytelling and provided a necessary constant to the story. And like in the original, every time the format is broken, there is always a good reason for it, and it's always very intriguing. Another thing that I love is the titles or quotes in each issues. All of them are very relevant and add a lot of insight into what the chapter is supposed to mean or supposed to signify, which is the same thing that happened in the original Watchmen, and I love that part in the original as well. There's even something that I like more in Doomsday Clock than I did in the original, and that's the story within a story trope that is present in both books. I never really understood what is so good about the Black Friday storyline in the original. I mean, I know why it's there, but I never particularly liked it. It felt dragging in many parts, but the story within the story in this one is always relevant to the main stories, and not only that, it never really dragged, and if anything, it's actually really good on its own. It's a very engaging story on its own, unlike the Black Freighter story, in my opinion. So, yeah. And despite all of the things that I said earlier, I want to give props to the writing in general. When the book finally did reach a certain thematic conclusion, what it had to say is a powerful thing. And I really like the main idea, even if it might have been introduced a bit too late, plus all the many introduced subplots, while most of them aren't fleshed out as much as I wanted to, they were all very interesting on a surface level basis. And sometimes the deconstruction did work well. Not often, but still. And just in general, the skill needed to carefully juggle all of these different characters and stories from different parts of the DC universe is something that I am in awe of, despite the execution's imperfection. And I think, yeah, this is just one of the things that Geoff Johns has always excelled in, I suppose. And this brings me to the main point of the good stuff. Basically, once I stopped trying to compare it to the original and to the HBO sequel, I couldn't stop reading. Generally, a story this complicated wouldn't be a page-turner for me, but somehow this was. The characters, both old and new, are all very engaging and memorable, with the exception of some that didn't really get enough page time, I suppose. The cliffhangers and the pacing are just generally perfect. The slow revelation of the mystery just made me keep wanting to read more and more. Johns has always had a knack for balancing these epic world-ending stakes with engaging human characters and packaging them into a very page-turning story. And this is just another example of that, I suppose. So yeah, overall, Doomsday Clock is a messy attempt at incorporating Watchmen into the DC universe, and as a direct sequel, it did not live up to neither the spirit nor the quality of the original. However, if I see it as its own thing, I had a blast reading it, and ultimately, isn't that all that matters? And yeah, if you want a good Watchmen sequel, just watch the HBO series. It's actually really, really good, both as a sequel and as its own story. But again, I don't really have much to say about that other people haven't said, so I'm not gonna review that. And yeah, I guess that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Bye.